Good afternoon, friends. We shall now start the second session of the Aesthetics Project, which pertains to the 9 rasas of Ibrahim Adil Shah, the illustrious ruler of Bijapur and a man of extraordinary artistic talent, as Kavita already has introduced him, and we are looking forward to hear more about him and his artistic activities. It is indeed a pleasure for me to introduce to you DEBORAH HUTTON, the speaker of this afternoon's session. As you already might have gathered from the announcements, DEBORAH is Associate Professor of Asian and Islamic Art History at the College of New Jersey in Ewing, New Jersey. DEBORAH's interest in Islamic art goes back to her graduate studies. Her original intention to study Turkish art was subtly bent by Kathy and Rick Asher, the renowned scholars of South Asian Islamic art, who were here last year, to open up the path for DEBORAH to Indian and especially Indo-Islamic art. In this case, Turkey's loss clearly was India's gain. So it is no surprise then that one of her earlier works of nearly 10 years ago deals with the codification of visual identity of the Indo-Islamic Sultanate of Bijapur, written at a time when most scholars of Indian art were engaged in constructing thematic narratives or searching for imaginary stylistic certitudes and the linear developments of genres of Mughal and Rajput painting. And we have already talked about in the morning that it's such a pity that Deccani art and the studies in Deccani art was really overshadowed by Mughal art and the studies on Mughal and Rajput art. And now we are really happy that the research on Deccani art is maturing. And earlier, only very few art historians had ventured into exploring the finer nuances of the magnificent provincial art and architecture of the Deccan region. Though the aesthetic and art historical importance of Deccani painting had begun to be recognized as early as the 1930s by Stella Crumrish, Basil Gray, and Hermann Goetz, followed by the work of Robert Skelton, and of course, Jagdish Mittal, who is here with us and who is in knowledge. It's an ocean of knowledge of Deccani painting, and not only painting, Deccani art as such. And later on by Mark Zebrowski and M.L. Nigam in the 1970s and 80s. DEBORAH HUTTON charted a different path with a close focus on and serious analysis of the genre of Deccani painting. DEBORAH's initial research led her to investigate more deeply the relationship between art, identity, and cultural exchange at the Indo-Islamic courts of the Deccan from the 16th through the early 20th century. This resulted in her insightful book, Art of the Court of Bijapur, which won the American Institute of Indian Studies Edward Dimmock Prize in the Indian Humanities. DEBORAH's book, to my mind, is one of the first studies to look at the interaction between architecture, ornament, painting, religious ideas, and aesthetic perceptions in a specific courtly environment, namely that of Bijapur. Let me read out a quote from her book, where she defines her innovative approach leading to the extraordinary intricacies and incongruities of understanding Bijapuri art. She says, I studied in great detail a limited number of specific works, such as paintings with identical subject matter, rather than attempting a complete survey of Bijapuri art from the period of 1565 to 1635, This approach allows me to use the optimal visual evidence that does survive, and at the same time acknowledge that this evidence is only the fragmented remains of a once remarkable whole. Additionally, the format lets the artworks remain in focus. This micro model for the study of any regional art form would yield fresh results, and as it makes one understand how, in Deccani or Bijapuri art, sensual perception is transformed into a material visual image. Deborah's study of Bijapuri art branched out into various seemingly diverse themes. In one, she traces the travels of the 16th century Dutch artist Cornelis Hedda, who, after 10 years of adventurous journeys, became the court artist of Ibrahim Adil Shah. I'm sure Deborah will talk more about him this afternoon. Another subject that emanates from her engagement with the Deccan is the study of the well-known photographer Raja Deen Dayal and his work at the court of the 6th Nizam of Hyderabad during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This research resulted in a book co-authored with scholar of photography Dipali Devan entitled Raja Deen Dayal, Artist-Photographer in the 19th Century India, done for the Al-Qazi Collection of Photography in 2013. Before handing over the mic to Deborah, I would just like to add that she has also curated exhibitions. And because of time constraint, I will only mention the most recent one, entitled Art Amongst War, Visual Culture in Afghanistan, 1979 to 2014, on show at the College of New Jersey. Now I think we all are eager to listen to Deborah, and she will speak to us on mixed metaphors, painting during the reign of Ibrahim Adil Shah. For the interpretation of some of the intriguing aspects of Deccani painting, she innovatively explores the contemporaneous poetry to unlock the metaphors and symbolism of these works. Deborah, please.
Thank you so much, you all, for being here, and thanks for the invitation to speak. I feel so honored to be taking part in this wonderful symposium, and I'm just so impressed with everything I've learned about the Aesthetics Project. So when I sat down to think about this talk in December, start to write it in December, I actually decided I didn't want to do my normal approach, which is to take a micro study, look at a few things, and make a specific scholarly point. I wanted to use this opportunity to really look at the painting from Ibrahim Adil Shah II's reign as a whole. And when I did, 6 points immediately came to mind that I wanted to convey to you today. 3 of those are what I see as the 3 primary reasons why studying painting from his reign is so compelling. The other 3 are the flip side of that, the corollary, the 3 things that present us with intellectual challenges. Not problems per se, but rather issues that shape the way we need to approach the material. And I'm hoping that by presenting these points, which is what I'll do today, for those of you who are new to Deccan art, this will provide you an overview of Bijapuri painting. And for those of you that are more familiar, it will give us some fodder for discussion. Before I get to those points, though, I'm going to give you just a very brief background on the Adil Shahis of Bijapur, which is what this panel is about. Navina nicely went over some of this, so I can be quite succinct. Bijapur was one of 5 Deccan sultanates formed from the breakup of the earlier Bahmani dynasty, which had been ruling the region since 1347. So on the left is a map showing the Bahmani dynasty, and then on the right is a map showing the 5 sultanates. And of course, the one we're concerned with is Bijapur, which was founded by Yusuf Adil Khan in 1490. Over time, Bijapur, along with Golconda, emerged as the largest and most powerful of the 5 sultanates, as you see here in this map showing the Deccan from the mid-17th century. Crucially, in 1565, at the so-called Battle of Talikota, the 5 sultanates defeated the ruler Ramraj of Vijayanagar. They defeated and killed him. And from this victory, Bijapur managed to receive the greatest amount of land, almost doubling the size of the kingdom and increasing its revenue considerably. It's in the years following the 1565 victory that we start to see architecture and painting really cultivated at Bijapur. It's in the 5 to 10 years after that that we see the city walls of Bijapur being built, the waterworks system, the Grand Jami Masjid, and we also see the development of a royal kitabkhane or book workshop under the rule of Ali Adil Shah I. So he's the ruler at this time. He ruled from 1558 until 1580. And we know about his book workshop both through historical accounts as well as surviving manuscripts. But it's during the reign of his nephew and successor, Ibrahim Adil Shah II, that art really begins to flourish. Ibrahim ruled from 1580 until 1627, and during the 5 decades of his reign, I wouldn't say that Bijapur was peaceful. There were certainly conflicts. The first decade of his reign, Bijapur was actually ruled by a regent, his aunt Chand Bibi, and there were various political intrigues and attacks from neighboring sultanates. But by and large, this was a fairly prosperous and peaceful time. Notably, Ibrahim managed to put off the growing threat of the Mughals invading them. He did this through judicious acts of appeasement. He married his daughter to Akbar's son, and he would periodically give very nice gifts to Jahangir. The Adil Shahis were even able to annex the neighboring sultanate of Bidar in 1619. And so this is the period when we see art really flourish, and these, of course, are 2 portraits of Ibrahim. Unfortunately, Ibrahim's son Muhammad was not able to put off the growing Mughal threat. And so in 1635, he was forced to sign a treaty making Bijapur a tributary to the Mughal Empire. And then 50 years later, Bijapur fell altogether to the Mughals in 1686, nearly 200 years after its founding. Now art, including wonderful paintings like the ones you're seeing here, continued to be made right up until the end of the dynasty. You see a portrait of Muhammad on the left, and on the right is the wonderful painting in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the House of Bijapur, which shows an imaginary meeting of all of the Adil Shahi sultans, and was made just 6 years before the dynasty fell to the Mughals. Despite, however, these masterpieces being made right up until the end of the dynasty, it's painting from the reign of Ibrahim that has received the absolute bulk of scholarly attention. And part of this is because the most paintings survive from this reign, but it begs the question of why. Why were so many paintings being created at this time, and why are they so intriguing for scholars? And so that brings me to those 3 points I want to make today. And the first one really is the primary one, suitable for a symposium held by the Aesthetics Project, and that is the physical appearance of the paintings themselves. So I have sort of some sub-points in this point. By the physical appearance, I mean the exquisiteness, the beauty of the paintings, their heterogeneity, that is, their stylistic range, the ways in which they incorporate unusual visual motifs that suggest that the artists were experimenting with visual motifs as a way of conveying something beyond reality, as a way, as I argued in my book, of connecting it with poetic metaphor. So all of that is point 1. I'm going to show you a range of images related to that point. Bear with me. I will let you know when we get to point 2. So we'll be on point 1 for a while. Let's start by taking a closer look at the portrait of Ibrahim Adil Shah II from the British Museum. This is just to introduce you to the style. It's very typical. You have this sort of the flowing robes in a breeze. You have these incredible sheer cloth juxtaposed with a very, very heavy use of gold for these sashes that kind of flare out from the body and are decorated with these geometric designs. Above, you have that modeling of the beard, that softness, typical Ibrahim era turban, then that lush dark green foliage, and that distant white palace or city. You find these again and again in many of the best Bijapuri paintings. So here, in the famous Chester Beatty Yogini, which we've already seen, again, these heavy gold sashes flaring out from her body, that distant white palace, that dark green foliage. But here, you also have this heavy gold sky in the background, and you have those magnificent oversized flowers, which, as Navina pointed out, come from Chinese textiles or Chinese ceramic designs, but they do something else, right? So you have artists experimenting with these visual motifs to convey to us, the viewer, that something more is going on here, that there's a deeper meaning for us to uncover. They seem to reflect her beauty. They suggest that something extraordinary is going on here. And we see that use of the heavy gold ground and extraordinary plants, again in this image of a prince, possibly Ibrahim Adil Shah II, napping in the Museum of Islamic Art in Berlin. So again, things that you're already starting to recognize, right? That heavy use of gold, that lush dark green foliage, these oversized plants. Here you have these flowers actually growing upside down towards him. And it creates a sense that something else is going on here, right? So what you see up there, is that the palace, the city that the prince has gone from for his afternoon wandering and nap, or is that the place that he's dreaming of while he's asleep? That kind of ambiguity, that suggestion, that experimenting with visual motifs to suggest something more is going on is something that you find, along with these lush colors. But not every painting from Bijapur is like that. Others use kind of a much more watercolor-like approach to the painting, and are more sort of prosaic subjects, like here, this groom and horse, done with this beautiful detail and shading around the face. Others eschew these bright orange reds and luscious greens for a more sedate color palette. We have several paintings that survive with these brown backgrounds and singular figures with light-colored robes. And note that the little bit of what's given there are these pairs of birds in each one. Other paintings that survive are, in fact, tinted drawings showing incredible draftsmanship with just hints of gold in particular places, as you see here in this image of Ibrahim Adil Shah on his elephant. And you can, I'm sorry I don't have any details of this one, because if you had details, you would see this extraordinary detail that's there. Sometimes those tinted drawings are combined with those exuberantly colored, oversized flowers that we mentioned earlier. And you see that here in these two single-page paintings of wandering ascetics, right? So you have these tinted drawings and then specific areas of bright colors, again, those oversized flowers, which do appear at this time a lot in figures of ascetics. There's some sort of link there. And you'll notice that both of these have this wonderful marbled paper on the borders, suggesting that they were part, or wanting us to think that they're part of an albums that had similar figures, perhaps with poetry. And in fact, the back of the male ascetic with the dog, on the back of that is part of a verse from the Kitab-i-Nuras, suggesting that these were parts of albums. And it's tempting to want to think that the marbling is original, but it's on separate pieces of paper, so we can't be sure. But Bijapur was known for this type of marbling, the Deccan in general, but also Bijapur. And that leads me, of course, to the wonderful marbled drawings, which, as Navina pointed out, we might be safer generally dating them to the Deccan, but and several other people would date them to the sort of very end of Ibrahim's reign in the first decade or so of Muhammad's reign from Bijapur. And these are images where the artists have used resist to apply marbling to areas of the painting. And there's about 24 of these that have been identified. And they're on a range of subject matter. Of course, if you want to learn more about them, I would suggest that you read Jagdish Mittal's wonderful article on the subject matter, and this wonderful painting, in fact, comes from his collection of the Fat Begum. So there's a range of subject matter from the Fat Begum to this birds attacking a dying nag. And I don't know if you all can see this, but the artist has actually included drops of blood coming down from the wound that the bird is pecking at, like right here. Now, there's a range of figures, but the dying nag, or the starving nag, is one that's oft repeated in two examples accompanied by an equally emaciated rider. So here the marbling is on the horse with this beautiful gold edging. And then in this version, the marbling has become the background, almost this psychedelic-like figure. And so what's interesting about these is that the emaciated horse on this emaciated rider on this emaciated horse is a common image in the Islamic world, in Sufi poetry and art. So the emaciated horse represents nafs, the base instinct, those things that we need to control in order to achieve union with God. And the emaciated rider is sort of the upper part of the soul, or the Sufi kind of trying to manage that, right? Likewise, marbling is a common motif throughout the Islamic world, but combining the two together is unique to this period. And it becomes even more extraordinary when you remind yourself that the word for this technique in Persian is not marbling or anything related to stone, but is abri, meaning cloud-like. So it's a representation of the clouds or the heavens. So think back to that wonderful deer hunting scene that Navina showed this morning, where there was a marbling-like technique in the sky. That's why, right? So, and in Sufi poetry, the sky was, the clouds were seen as the mercy of God, right? And the skies are representing heavens. So what you have going on here is you have these artists putting together visual motifs in ways that we can read with layers of meaning. And it's not just the motifs that are representative come from poetry, but the way that they're being layered comes from poetry as well. And here I want to quote the wonderful introduction to a book on the Sufi poem Madhumalati, written by Aditya Bahel and Simon Reutemann. And so they're talking about Sufi poetry, and they say here, the authors use symbolism to, quote, evoke the scent of the invisible world. And I would argue that Bijapuri artists were experimenting with visual motifs for very much the same effect, right? To evoke the scent or the flavor or the rasa of the invisible world. And they go on to say that these symbols are multivalent and multi-layered, containing as many levels of meaning as there are levels of the soul for the reader to apprehend. Rather than a straightforward allegory, which requires point-to-point correspondence between levels of meaning, these works are full of multiple suggestions and resonances. And that seems to be what the artists at Bijapur were experimenting at this time with as well. And let me give you another example. So the Paim name is an original manuscript written and illustrated during Ibrahim's reign. It's in the genre of the Prem Marg, or Path of Love, Sufi romance literature. So in this literature, a prince, it always starts off that a prince has a vision of a beloved that he goes off in search of. And of course, this search is meant to mirror the search, the spiritual search of the Sufi for union with God. And in this one, the prince, whose name is Shahji, we see him, this is the first illustration, where he's listening to a yogini play music. And note, again, the oversized flowers right next to the yogini, right? What's remarkable about this manuscript is that in every single illustration of Shahji, he has the face of the beloved drawn on his heart. Can you see that right here? Reflecting a sentiment in the poem in which it says that after he had this vision of her, her face was locked in his heart, or held in his heart. And another illustration from that manuscript here is the Princess Maji So there's Shahji and Maji. Maji is sitting here amongst the women of the harem. They're celebrating Holi. But rather than taking part, she's longing for her beloved. And that longing is symbolized by the flames that are rising up for her, despite the fact that she's being doused with water. So we have at this time in Bijapur, like I said, this experimentation with visual motifs that are highly unusual, that you see either nowhere else or very few other places. And that experimentation includes portraits of Ibrahim. So as Kavita said in her introduction, we have no portraits of Ibrahim at Darbar. We have no portraits of him on the battlefield. We don't even have any portraits of him hunting. Hawking is as close as we get to these typical tropes of the South Asian ruler that we're used to seeing. So instead, we have these experimentations, that head and shoulders shot that Navina showed earlier, highly unusual, right? Such a close-up. But then other images of him, he's quite small. So here, he's barely visible, riding atop his elephant. In other ones, here he's shown venerating a Sufi, but he's off to the side, not the main character. And then in other illustrations, here we have him presenting a necklace to his lover. And so we have a range of subject matter, a range of style. So all of that heterogeneous styles that I showed you are represented in portraits of Ibrahim. And even how he looks varies from portrait to portrait. In my book, I actually argue that we shouldn't see these as physical portraits of him, but they're portraits of poetic representations of him, which is probably best personified in this painting here, where it very much mirrors verses that describe his appearance, where he has red fingernails, wearing dried beads of a Shaivite, playing music with his favorite elephant in the city of Bijapur behind him. So all of that is point one, right? The beauty of the images, their heterogeneous nature, and the use of poetic metaphor. Am I already behind? I have 35 minutes. Okay, point one took a lot of time. I will go faster. So that brings me to point two, which is Ibrahim himself as a fascinating historical figure, particularly the religious synthesis and courtly culture fostered during his reign. A lot of this has already been said, so I can sum that up, right? He was open to Sufism, but also to Hinduism. He saw the goddess Saraswati as his mother, the god Ganesh as his father. So he says this in a verse of poetry, but in the next verse praises the Prophet Muhammad. He was known, of course, most known for the Kitab-i-Nuras that he wrote, and this term. And so it wasn't just the cultural religious synthesis, but also the love of words, the love of poetry during his reign. And I'll just read one verse from the Kitab-i-Nuras, a translation, which embodies much of his courtly culture. There are different languages, but there is one emotional appeal. Be he a Brahmin or a Turk, the goddess of learning smiles. Be he a Brahmin or a Turk, he is only fortunate on whom the goddess of learning smiles. O Ibrahim, the world seeks only knowledge. Serve and meditate upon with steadfast heart the power of words. And the word that had the most power at the court of Ibrahim was Nuras, right? So the Kitab-i-Nuras. Nuras refers to the 9 rasas, but also in Persian, new arrival or new flavor. And so it was a word that had resonances in both Indic culture and Persianate culture, and the entire court was obsessed with the term. There were at least 17 different items named Nuras, including the new city of Noraspur, which Ibrahim founded in 1599. And at the center of it was the Noras Mahal, which was surrounded by a 9-sided enclosure, so an obvious architectural pun on the word Nuras. And it was here that the Eid-i-Nuras, which was a holiday celebrated whenever a Friday fell on the 9th day of the month, and it was celebrated with day-long performances of storytelling and music. Okay, so this unique courtly culture that was fostered during his reign brings me to my third point, and that is the juxtaposition that Bijapuri art provides with Mughal art of the same period. So Ibrahim's reign overlapped with that of Akbar. Akbar ruled until 1605, and then with that of Jahangir. Jahangir took over. And none of us would confuse a Bijapuri painting with a Mughal painting. They're clearly quite different. And that's an important point. It reminds us that Indo-Islamic art did not take the same form, right? Art is not a mathematical equation. Take Indic and Persianate, you'll get the same thing. And it's more important, and that's true even when they're drawing on the same subject matter. So Sufism is something that's been important to Indo-Islamic rulers throughout history, but the way that Sufism gets represented in paintings at this time is incredibly different. So here we have Akbar. This is a page from the Akbarnama. Akbar's storming up, charging up the hill to go visit the Sufi sheikh. And there's no doubt that that's Akbar. You can recognize him right away. I've seen British school children doing that on field trips to the Victoria and Albert Museum. And you have all of this royal accoutrements around him. Whereas over here, in this visitor, possibly Ibrahim Adil Shah, to a Sufi dervish, which we saw earlier, it's a much different scene, right? There's no royal accoutrements. Instead, we have this very humble scene, but the oddly oversized parrot. I also point out that we have Shia standards here. So the religious synthesis going on at Bijapur was not just between Hinduism and Islam, but forms of Islam. And then we have this figure here, very humbly dressed, that may or may not be Ibrahim. Can you imagine looking at a portrait from Akbar's reign and not being sure if it was a portrait of Akbar? So even the fact that we can't identify these, there's something going on here that's quite different. And it's important to recognize, because as those of you who study North India know, the Indian painting is often thought about as this binary between Mughal and Rajput. And it's often considered in terms of religion or cultural traditions, right? But you add Deccan art to that mix, and all of a sudden that binary gets complicated. And we have to come up with other ways to talk about the differences that are going on here. So those are 3 reasons to study Bijapuri painting from Ibrahim's reign, why it's compelling. The beauty of the images, their diversity, the way that they incorporate poetic metaphor, Ibrahim's person as a historical figure, and the difference it provides with Mughal art. But each one of those things also has a corollary, a flip side, issues that shape the way we need to approach the material. So I'll turn to those now. Okay, so first, the painting's physical appearance. As beautiful as they are, as intriguing as they are, they're also darn frustrating from another perspective. We have only about 4 or 5 illustrated manuscripts that survive from Ibrahim's reign. And we have between 70 and 80 paintings from his reign that survive from 70 to 80 single-page paintings that survive from his reign and the decade thereafter. Of these 70 to 80 paintings, as Keelan Overton describes in her very wonderful dissertation, PhD dissertation on Bijapuri painting, of the approximately 70 to 80 single-page paintings datable to Ibrahim's reign, not a single one is dated. Not a single one is labeled with the place of production. Only one, and that would be the image of Saraswati, has an inscription giving us the patron, and only five contain indisputable signatures by the artist on the picture plane. So that's not very much historical evidence. So these two, so we only know the names of 2, possibly 3 Bijapuri artists, the most famous one being Farooq Hussein, and I'm showing you 2 images by him here. And he's mentioned in the court histories as being one of Ibrahim's top nobles, but there's still a debate among scholars as to whether Farooq Hussein is also Farooq Beg, the Mughal artist, right? So even here, the best known artist, we have questions about. Another artist is Ali Reza, and so I'm showing you 2 works signed with signatures saying they're by Ali Reza, and you can see that they're quite diverse in style, and we know nothing about Ali Reza. So what do we do about this? And the histories of the time, they don't talk about the Kitab Khane. We know nothing of its structure. Like I said, the only painter that's mentioned is Farooq Hussein. So all of the work that we do on Bijapuri painting is based on connoisseurship, on stylistic analysis. And we are very lucky that supremely talented connoisseurs have turned their eyes to Bijapuri painting, some of whom are in this room. So we're lucky that we have that. And connoisseurship is reliable in many ways. I want to show you an example where connoisseurship has turned out to be very reliable. And that is the Nujum al-Ulum manuscript, which bears a date, dating it to 1570-71. This is the famous manuscript of the Stars of Science that's in the Chester Beatty Library. For years, art historians had attributed it based on style to Bijapur, to the royal court of Bijapur during the reign of Ali Adil Shah I. But it doesn't have a colophon page. And it was complicated by an inscription on the very first folio saying that Ibrahim Adil Shah II had a noble buy it for the library. So some people said, well, why would it have been made at Bijapur? If it was made at Bijapur, why would Ibrahim need to buy it? But most art historians looked at the style, including myself, and said, no, this is a royal Bijapuri manuscript. I talked about it in my book that way. Right before my book was going to come out, a very serious scholar came to me. He'd written a review of my book, and he said, he said to me one-on-one, I really like your book, but I have to tell you, I don't think the Nujum al-Ulum is from Bijapur, and I think I can prove it. And if anyone, my stomach was up in my throat, and I thought, oh my gosh, the first chapter of my book is going to be disproven before it's even out. Great. This is one of the things that led me to work on the 19th century and photography. I needed something where it wasn't all just a house of cards. But then Emma Flatt, who will be speaking tomorrow, really took the time to study the manuscript itself. The Persian, it's beautiful calligraphy, but it's a very odd manuscript. It's on magic, and it combines all these different things, so it's very difficult to read. But she found buried in the middle of the manuscript on a discussion of the planets and their favorite desserts and their likes and dislikes, a discussion of the planet Venus, it said, and the author of this list of likes and dislikes is Ali, known as Adil Shah. Meaning that not only was the manuscript from Bijapur, the royal court of Bijapur, it was actually written by the Sultan himself, or attributed to being written by him. So there's a case where what art historians knew through connoisseurship was proven right. But stylistic attribution is a tricky thing, and it yields diminishing resources. So let's go back and look at Ali Reza here and look at this painting. It's such a distinctive painting, right? It's tempting to look at this and say, we have to be able to identify that style again. And that's what art historians do. They'll look at these and identify hands. So people are tempted to identify an oeuvre or a body of work attributed to Ali Reza. And so they look at the Sufi saint and then look at the seated devotee and look at the beards and the three-quarters position and the shape of the nose and the eyebrows and the eyes. And they say, aha, these are by the same artist. We can start to develop a corpus of work for Ali Reza, right? And you get excited. And then you look at this Hindu aesthetic and you say, look, same three-quarter pose, same beard, same nose, same eyebrows, right? Must be again by him. But if you step back and you look at the entire paintings, they're completely different. Connoisseurship has its limits, right? We have to recognize that artists looked at each other's works, artists traveled, artists could paint in multiple styles, and more than one artist could work on a painting. So what do? How do I identify a painting by an artist newly arrived from Ahmednagar, or who was working with someone who was newly arrived from Iran? How do we talk about these things? I'm not saying that we shouldn't do connoisseurship studies, but I think at times we have to step back and remind ourselves of what we don't know, and where is this going to take us? We know nothing about who Ali Reza is. Should all of our efforts be put into trying to identify a corpus of his work, or do we need to ask other questions? And there's so many things that we don't know. Clearly, these would have been put together in albums, and the albums would have had other images and calligraphy, and these would have shaped how viewers responded to the images in their original context. Not a single Bijapuri album survives, and we're not even close to being able to assemble one virtually. To give you one idea of how these albums might have changed how we read the images, this is a yogini painting in the British Museum. This is the verso. Right? So we know they're part of the same album because they're on the same page. These yogini images have gotten a lot of study by various people, including myself, but we disagree on what they mean. But when you look on the backside and you see that here's a woman in European dress, and you think that maybe this was an album of beautiful women, types of beautiful women, a whole other set of meanings comes up that we need to consider. Likewise, Bijapur painting we know from histories had all this wall painting, very little of which survives. Noraspur was supposed to be covered in wall painting, but because the city was destroyed by Malik Ambar in 1624, none of it survives. We get some idea from the remains at Kumatki, the pleasure pavilions, but these are seriously damaged. They've been overpainted, calligraphy, and we really can't get a sense of what that original environment was. Okay, so my point is that we need to remind ourselves of what we don't know and how what we don't know might impact what we think we know. So for example, right now, a huge portion of the surviving single-page paintings seem to be portraits of Ibrahim, giving him this very big role in the art. But is that really what was the dominant art form at the time? Or is that just what we're able to identify using connoisseurship, right? A portrait of Ibrahim makes it pretty sure that it's from his reign. So that's the question. And that brings me to my next point, which is the danger of overemphasizing Ibrahim Adil Shah II, of turning him into a hero, into the artistic genius behind these works. I don't think that the paintings were lyrical because he liked music. That's oversimplifying the relationship between artist and patron. Moreover, he's often assumed to be the patron of everything, even when we know he wasn't. And I'll give you one quick example from architecture. The Ibrahim Rauza, considered the masterpiece, right, of architecture from his reign, was not patronized by Ibrahim. It was patronized by his wife, Taj Sultana, and the architect, supervisor for construction, was an Ethiopian emigre named Malik Sandal. If we only talk about Ibrahim, we write out these other equally interesting figures from the history. There's another damaging effect of that, and that is that when you have heroes, you turn other people into villains. The scholar Carl Ernst has talked about this trend in Indian history of historiomachy, of turning certain figures into heroes and villains, Akbar, Aurangzeb being an example of that. And in Bijapur, traditionally, Ali Adil Shah, Ibrahim's uncle, has been turned into this villain. He's literally talked about as a militant Shia who didn't care for the arts. But in fact, that's not true. There's lots of historical evidence to show he was an important patron of the arts. So I would argue that we need to see Ibrahim as not the author of the courtly culture of his time, but an actor within that courtly culture. Undoubtedly the lead actor, but just one actor in that courtly culture. Okay, and that leads me to my final point. How am I doing on time? Good? Oh, all right. So I skimmed over a few things there. I'm happy to answer any of these things and questions. My final point is that, and I would argue that I've been most guilty of this one, is that we get so excited by the unique qualities of Bijapuri art and the way in which it's distinct from the Mughals that we neglect to recognize how it was part of larger global cultures, including Perso-Islamic cultures. Again, Keelan Overton, in her dissertation, explains this very well. She says, we're all obsessed with Ibrahim's title, Jagat Guru, world teacher, that we neglect to look and see all the other titles that he went by. And she's analyzed actually the seals on his books, that he put on his books, and shows that he, in fact, more than often than not, used a series of Islamic titles that most Perso-Islamic rulers would use, things like friend of God and things like that. And she points out that, you know, his 6 top nobles that are listed in the histories are all from Iran, that a large number of books in his library that we know of were from Shiraz, and that his prime minister was also from Shiraz, so that there's this close connection between Bijapur and Shiraz, Iran, that really hasn't been investigated. And I would push that forward and also bring up Bijapur's relationship with the early modern world at large. As was brought up this morning, Bijapur is right next to Goa. You know, when Asad Beg, the Mughal ambassador, brought back tobacco for Akbar to try, he had bought it at the markets at Bijapur. So Bijapur has this interaction with the rest of the world. And that includes paintings of European subject matters. Paintings of European subject matters have been studied so much in the Mughal context, very little in the Deccan context to date. And this is actually what I've been working on of late, was trying to see about how could we put Bijapur in this global context. And I teamed up with a specialist in Dutch art to trace the travels of a Dutch artist named Cornelius Clautze Heda. So when I said before we only have 2 or 3 artists that we know of at Bijapur court, I lied. There's one more, Cornelius Clautze Heda. Now, of course, because it's Bijapur, we can't have all the evidence we want, so no paintings by him survive anywhere in the world. We know from accounts in the Netherlands that he was a Dutch Mannerist painter, so I'm showing you a Dutch Mannerist painting here, so you can get an idea the style he worked in. What does survive are a series of letters that he wrote from Noraspor, which is where he lived, to the Dutch East India Company. And so here's a copy of one of those letters. And in them, he recounts this 10-year remarkable journey that took him to the court of Ibrahim. And by the way, the first painting, when he arrives at Ibrahim's court, Ibrahim says to him, "I have long wanted a painter from your land," and orders him to make a painting. So Heda says he made a painting of Venus, Bacchus, and Cupid. And so the painting I'm showing you here is a Dutch Mannerist painting of Venus, Bacchus, and Cupid. So you can imagine that this was what was produced for Ibrahim. Oops. And so we traced his travels. So he started off in 1600 in the Netherlands. He wanted to be a court artist. Court art was fading in the Netherlands, so he first travels to the court of Rudolf II in Prague to try to become a court artist there. He doesn't have much luck, but Shah Abbas of the Safavid Empire had sent an embassy to get Rudolf's help in fighting the Ottomans. They invite Heda to become a court artist for Shah Abbas. He says yes. They try various ways to get there, but because of conflicts, the only way that they can get to Isfahan is to catch a ride on the ships carrying the new viceroy to Goa, Portuguese viceroy to Goa. So they do. They travel around Africa. They winter in Mozambique. While they're wintering, the viceroy comes to suspect Heda of being a spy, throws him in prison, takes him to Goa rather than Isfahan with the rest of the ambassadorial party. In Goa, he manages to get released, and the viceroy asks him if he wants to be artist to him. He says no, and he travels inland, and in 1610 ends up at the court of Ibrahim Adil Shah II, where he remains until his death in 1624. And at the time of his death, he lived in a house large enough that when the Safavid ambassador came to visit, he stayed in Heda's house after Heda had passed away. What's interesting about this is that Heda didn't change his style, didn't change his way of being. Even though he was from all the way over here, he knew what it meant to be a court artist. He knew what was expected of him, and Ibrahim knew what was expected of him. He knew to expect financial security. He knew that it was about being the exotic commodity at court, that part of it was spectacle. He engaged in diplomacy, in trade, in all of these things, and it suggests that there was a global courtly culture that Bijapur was also a part of at this time. Okay, so to conclude, And I'm just showing you 3 more paintings from the reign of Ibrahim, just so I could squeeze in as many as possible for you to see. Paintings from the reign of Ibrahim Adil Shah II compel us to look closely, to study each image with great care, to investigate the particularities of the culture and the history of the court. But at the same time, the 3 issues I just outlined challenge us to take a step back, to look more broadly. And indeed, those 3 issues are not just particular to Bijapur, but are in fact the 3 main issues confronting the field of art history today as a whole. Namely, what is the place of connoisseurship at a time when the field is moving more towards visual culture and visual anthropology and questioning the idea of the master artistic genius or a canon of objects? 2, how do we evaluate the role of the patron in the artistic process? How do we articulate it in a way that is more complex and subtle? And 3, how do we better account for the global flow of people, images, and ideas when discussing the art of a particular locale? And on this last point, Naman kind of wonderfully articulated that at the end of his last at the conclusion of his talk about how do we talk about these ideas of cosmopolitanism and transnationalism. So when we think about this, we think about these 3 issues, Bijapuri art, as obscure as it may seem in many ways, is the perfect case study to investigate these questions that are at the heart of the discipline of art history today. And so if we look at it from that perspective, Bijapur goes from being this interesting oddity at the periphery of the discussion to really being something that can be at the center of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah, for such an insightful talk. And you really walked us through the whole range of Bijapuri art, and not only that, but also the kind of influences that might have created and constructed what was Bijapur, what was the art in Bijapur. And I was wondering, I mean, is there something that one can say that this is Bijapur art, this is style in Bijapur painting, as compared, I mean, you showed also like Mughal painting, you showed Rajasthani painting and the interaction. And is there something that one can really see, this is identifiable?
One thing I will say about the distinction between Bijapuri art and Mughal art, we can all look at it and we see it's there, but trying to define what that difference is what I'd call the Venus flytrap of intellectual inquiry. It's seductive, it lures you in, but you try to put forward an idea and you're snapped, right? Like you can always find an exception. That if you try to say, well, Bijapuri painting is more otherworldly and Mughal is more realistic, there'll be an exception to it. So I've had lots of conversations with people about it. We all try to hypothesize what it is, but it's difficult to pinpoint. There are stylistic things that we can attribute to Bijapur, although as I tried, and I subscribe to many of them myself, but as I tried to problematize in the second half of my paper, the problem with that then is that the only paintings that we identify as from Bijapur are the ones that fit what we already think of as a style. So there could be paintings from Bijapur that are very Shirazi in style that we think are from Golconda, because that's something we identify with Golconda painting. So yes, the way the field is constructed now, absolutely, there are things we can say. But I wonder if we'll say that in another 10 or 20 years.
Then maybe just let me pick up again on the Dutch artist who came to Bijapur. I think that is quite a fascinating subject, and we know too little about these things, and I think it's quite amazing that you could read the letters and you could find out what his whole journey, adventurous journey, how he reached Bijapur. And he writes about what he was painting. Does one know anything? I mean, you showed a little bit some paintings which have European themes or so. Does he write about this kind of interaction with other painters or with the patron? Is there anything that he talks about, the artistic, the visual strategies that he's using here in faraway India?
That's a great question. He talks about Ibrahim's reception of his initial painting. He says Ibrahim stared at it for 3 hours and immediately ordered him to make another work and paid him quite well. I mean, he talks a lot about how much he was getting paid. And he says that Bijapur would be a great place for other artists. But interestingly, in his letters, subsequent letters, and he's writing to the Dutch East India Company, so he's writing with a particular agenda. He only talks about painting as a way of whiling away the time. And what he talks more about are, he helps the Dutch get a license to open a factory in Bijapur's territory. He talks about the movements of the Portuguese, so he gives the Dutch information about that. He asks after his mother. He asks after perhaps selling some borax and some other things. So in that way, it seems like painting, I mean, and honestly, truth be told, he probably wasn't a very good painter, right? But that wasn't his appeal in Bijapur. He was an exotic commodity to be collected. And it's interesting that he's stationed not in Bijapur, but he's in Noraspur. So he's an example of that new arrival, that new flavor, right, that would mark this cosmopolitan court.
Can one say that Orientalism starts kind of in this period?
Yes, yeah, exactly. And I think we're used to talking about the Europeans, rulers like Rudolph II collecting things from around the world. But it was also, at this period, it was also rulers in India were interested, all over the world were interested in exotic things from other parts, for sure, yeah.
You were mentioning also Goa, and since we are now at the European influence in paintings or painting styles or so, is there anything, I mean, you mentioned that Goa is very nearby, it's in the kind of territory in the neighborhood. The Portuguese came there, they brought many things from Europe, like the tobacco, and so is there any other thing that you could imagine that was a kind of influence from, except paintings also, but any kind of, in the lifestyle or in maybe even whatever textiles, costumes, and any of the other things?
That's a great question. Certainly Portuguese wine, horses, the jewel merchants are coming and going. I think we know that there were soldiers who would come from Goa and work in Bijapur and then go back to Goa. And that's something else that's going on here. We have nobles coming and going between the kingdoms, Ethiopia. I don't know. Again, I think that's something that we need to look more closely at. And a lot of there's several images of women in European dress that we can trace to the Deccan from this period, but it's not clear to me whether they're European women or Indian women in European dress. So there's a lot of work there to be done.
I mean, just reading about Deccan painting and, like Mark Zabrowski, DEBORAH, and also I like Emma Flatt and writing about articles and about yoginis and also about the portraits of Ibrahim Adil Shah. And many scholars, they talk about a kind of idea of escapism with regard to the essence and general perception of the whole genre of Bijapur painting. I mean, you have mentioned
yes.
a lot of depictions of Ibrahim Adil Shah relaxing, having a nap in the afternoon with music and so, and the idea of like what one usually connects with a kind of a ruler, like, fighting or killing the enemy or big armies, that is not there. So the idea of escapism appeared or was essentially attached to these kind of portraits. Like Mark Zabrowski says in one of his writings, it epitomizes the escapist mood of Deccani courts. And what Douglas Barrett says, it is lack of practicality in that sense, like being a ruler. Would you say that this kind of stream of escapism was right from its inception, the essence of Bijapuri way of governance and courtly identity? Or did it develop over time and was consciously nurtured?
That's again another great question. What's interesting is that if we think about Ibrahim as the focus of the courtly culture, it's easy to think of it as escapism because he didn't fight a lot of battles. There's a European merchant who talks about Ibrahim as being a coward because he just pays off Jahangir. He'll get rid of all his money rather than have to fight him. But if you consider the art made during the reign of Ali Adil Shah I, which really I think a lot of the trends that we see get fully developed during Ibrahim's reign started during Ali's reign. And the Najum al-Ulum is an excellent example of that, of this interest in Hindu mysticism as well as Islamic mysticism and magic. Ali was a active ruler. I mean, he was a magnificent ruler. He was the one who was at the head of the battle that beat Ramraj of Vijayanagar. He's the one who laid the waterworks, the city walls, the Jami Masjid. And so he's interested in these things that we look at today as escapist, as poetry, music, interest in magic and mysticism. But he was really using it in a way to better rule this newly doubled in size kingdom. So I think that that's another reason why I think having that bigger picture and not just focusing on one figure is so important to kind of getting at the character. Yeah.
Even the founding of a new city called now Raspur,
yes,
which was having not necessarily kind of fortification walls, but more like a kitab khana or some kind of festivities and so.
Well, it did have walls. They just didn't complete the walls before Malik Ambar attacked. But I think Mark will talk more about that in his presentation. But I think, it's interesting. Naraspur does not have a Jami Masjid, so it's not. But I don't. Yeah, it's an interesting question. So.
Yeah, I mean one things which I just really am personally also interested, the kind of yogini paintings. Who says, who calls them yogini? Is there any kind of inscription anywhere or in any manuscript that talks about them? Because here we are talking about, for example, like Deccani Urdu manuscripts, we are talking about Persian translations of Sanskrit texts. We are ourselves speaking in English, so this kind of idea of translation or transliteration or kind of ideas of translocation concepts and religious concept, mystical concept, how is it? Because also the term ruhaniya also appears in this kind of context.
So in the Najum al-Ulum, they're called ruhani. The single page paintings don't have inscriptions that name them. We call them yoginis. That's something that we're attributing to them, and that's one of the controversies about them. Is that there's two frames of thought. Some people think that, like, the Chester Bida yogini is in fact a Muslim woman disguised as a Hindu ascetic to go off and find her beloved, which is a common trope in later Lucknowi poetry. And if you look at her dress and all of the jewels, there's a lot to suggest that this is a woman in disguise. But others have argued that no, in fact, that they're related to very specific forms of Shaivite practice. So we're not in agreement on what they mean. And that was, I think, the point I wanted to make about we don't have the larger context. An image of a yogini in an album full of images of beautiful women all of a sudden takes on a whole other meaning. So we're missing we don't know what they called them. We don't know the original context. Yeah.
The paintings at Bijapur are absolutely unique as paintings. The manner, the stylistic manner, the way they treat the subject matter is phenomenally different to other places in India. So you have not been able to identify any painters, right?
Well, we have two painters that we know.
Okay. So it seems to me that one should really focus on how great these paintings are with their colors, the contrast of texture and everything, which hasn't happened anywhere else in Indian miniatures. It's quite different. So, that's really what you need to focus on. Doesn't matter, Are you asking where these guys come from? No, it came from that. They were there and they painted them.
Painting a plate was a celebration of our
Yes.
The relationship of this world to a world that continues in Karnataka today, which is the world of Kannada Islam and Kannada Sufi practice, which is completely silenced in Deccani painting studies. And there are scholars like Rahmat Tarakare and other people who've been looking at ghazals and who have a real argument with words like syncretic to characterize this period or this time and the way that it has evolved. There are people, there's Sirpur painting. There's Sirpur painting there, which has been collected by, there's an artist who lives in Gulbarga, very small remnants. So it's like somehow that escapism that clouds our ability to see Ibrahim, Bijapur painting as being connected to a world of painting and a cosmopolitan world actually also fails to localize it.
Very interesting
in both
point.
directions. And that's very important.
Thank you. Will you find me afterwards? I would love to get some references from you for some articles. Yeah, thank you.
Deborah, when you mention about this manuscript of Nuzum Ulum, that it bears a name, and thanks to you for informing here, as well as giving me a lead to that article written by Emma Fatt. But it's a very interesting thing. It leads to two other answers or questions. One thing, that after the fall of Vijayanagar in 1565, many artists have joined the Bijapuri court as painters. The Nuzum Ulum has at least 4 or 5 types of painters. And one thing, when we think of the Saraswati painting as if Ibrahim Adil Shah was the first to revere Indian gods and goddesses, but here, of course, the answer of who was guiding the whole studio of the Bijapuri, because it's a highly complicated subject. When Ali Adil Shah has used some of the Indian gods and goddesses also, it means it was not originally the idea of Ibrahim Adil Shah to revere the Indian gods. It had started already in the time of Ali Adil Shah first. The second thing is that it is not easy to just leave that painting to be illustrated. It is not like Akbarnama or thing, and the artist is left to imagine and paint. It was highly complicated themes. Means there must have been a great rapport between the Bijapuri painters as well as the rulers. I mean, so happens also again in the course of Ibrahim Adil Shah. So now we have to think of the difference of the patronage at the Mughal court as well as the Bijapuri court. Means the artists had freedom to sit with the ruler, get the ideas properly explained, and then paint. It is not easy to create a manuscript illustration like Nuzum. I mean, highly mathematical things, astronomical questions, so many types of things are involved. It was not easy. And when we think of the glory of the Mughal painting or Mughal history dominating the Indian history so far, I think the question of patronage is another part which is very important in the Deccan. When Ibrahim Adil Shah made Shah Khalilullah sit on the throne after completed Kitab-e-Nawras, that's a sort of patronage so different. So also at the court of the Venkat after the fall of Bijapur in 1600, when some of the European painters from Madras brought some paintings to him, he was very much surprised and inquired who are the painters. He wanted to meet them. He invited them to paint. They stayed with him for months, and when they were painting, he was sitting with the painters to observe how they are being painted and things like this, inquired about their welfare, inquired. Third thing is about Haida. When he approaches Bijapur, Ibrahim Adil Shah court, without thinking anything, I mean, he accepted him as a painter without knowing his style. What was the reason? Means the freedom and love to know about other paintings also was very keen feature in Bijapur. Whereas the Mughal painters were recognized now, we are recognizing, but in their own time, you would be surprised to know that the calligraphers were getting 4 or 5 times more pay than the painters. John Seiler has been working for years on these things. So the question of patronage is very different from the Mughal as well as in the Deccan.
Thank you very much. I assume, as always, Mittal Saab has the last word.
Yes,
There's nothing that you can
absolutely.
add to what he has to say. So once
Yes.
again, we salute you.